On December 6, 1991, firefighters arrived at a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas to put out a fire. They kicked in the back door through the smoke and the heat. The first firefighter's flashlight cut through the smoke, and the beam landed on 4 small shapes huddled against the back wall, bound so tightly their fingers had turned purple. Their heads slumped forward like broken dolls someone had tried to burn. One of them had been sexually assaulted so violently the scene looked less like a crime and more like something that had been feeding. The building had been set on fire to hide what was done to them. But the fire hadn't finished its work yet. The smell was still there. Amy Ayers was 13 years old. Eliza Thomas was 17. Jennifer Harbison was 17. Sarah Harbison was 15. Jennifer and Sarah were sisters, 4 girls, bound, gagged, shot once in the head at close range. And then someone set the building on fire, not in a panic, not in a rush, deliberately. The way someone sets a fire when they have done this before, and they know exactly what fire does to evidence. The real killer walked out of that building, got in his car, drove out of Austin, and spent the next 8 years living his life, killing again and again. While 4 innocent boys took the blame, 2 of them confessed to murders they did not commit. 1 went to death row. 1 died before his name was cleared. In February 2026, 34 years later, a judge looked at the surviving men in that courtroom and said 2 words: "You're innocent." But 1 chair was empty. This is buried judgment. This is what the system tried to bury. And this is what we're digging up. Subscribe. The files are open. You need to know who these girls were before you know what was done to them. Not the case file version, not the names and ages version, the real version, the version where they were people. Jennifer Harbison was 17 years old. She had her whole life arranged the way 17-year-olds arrange their lives, around friends and plans, and the small important things that feel enormous at 17 and disappear entirely when you look back from far enough away. She worked at the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop on Guadalupe Street. It was not a meaningful job. It was a teenager's job, the kind that exists to give you spending money and somewhere to be after school, and the specific low-stakes independence of earning something that is yours. Sarah Harbison was 15, Jennifer's little sister, 2 years younger. Working beside her the way little sisters do when they are finally old enough to share a job, but still young enough that being near their older sister feels like something worth showing up for. Sarah was still wearing the little silver bracelet Jennifer had given her for her birthday 2 weeks earlier, the one with the tiny yogurt cup charm that jingled when she moved. She had worn it every day since Jennifer gave it to her. She was wearing it that night, behind the counter of the yogurt shop on Guadalupe Street, on a Tuesday in December, the charm jingling every time she reached for something, a small sound. Ordinary, the kind of sound that does not mean anything until suddenly it means everything. Eliza Thomas was 17. She had come to pick them up when their shift ended, not because she had to, because that is what friends do. She was waiting in that building for the shift to end so she could drive her friends home. She never drove anyone anywhere again. Amy Ayers was 13 years old. She was Sarah's best friend, the youngest one, the one who was not supposed to be there in any official capacity, who had come because 13 years old, and your best friend's older sister's closing shift on a Tuesday is still better than being home alone. She was there because she wanted to be near her friend, because that is the specific logic of 13, of not yet knowing that some Tuesday nights do not end the way Tuesday nights are supposed to end. 4 girls, 2 working, 2 waiting, none of them going home. The investigators who walked through what was left of that building in the early hours of December 7th did not use the word horrific in their reports. They used the word methodical. That is a more disturbing word. Horrific describes something that went wrong, something that escalated beyond what anyone intended. Methodical describes something that went exactly as planned. The register had not been emptied. The safe had not been touched. This was not a robbery that escalated. This was not a confrontation that got out of hand. Whoever entered that building that night came for one specific purpose, and they took their time fulfilling it. The bindings were so tight, the cloth had cut deep into their wrists, not the sloppy work of someone in a panic, but the slow, deliberate work of someone who had done this before, someone who enjoyed the way the fabric bit into skin until the fingers turned purple and stopped moving. Each girl secured separately, positioned, not left where they fell, arranged, with the specific careful attention of someone who had a preference about how they wanted things to look, who had thought about this beforehand in enough detail to have preferences. The positioning of each girl was deliberate in ways that the investigators described in their reports with the specific careful brevity of people who have decided that full description serves no professional purpose. And who were wrong about that, because the full description is the only thing that tells you what kind of person did this. Not a person who lost control, a person who was entirely in control the entire time. The gagging was the same, deliberate, specific, designed to prevent sound from carrying beyond the walls of that building while the things that needed to happen inside it happened. And then the assault, the kind of violence that is not incidental, not a byproduct of something else. The point, the thing the person came for. The specific extended deliberate horror of what was done to at least one of those girls before she was killed. That made a veteran investigator who had seen things stand in the middle of that scene and say nothing he had seen before had prepared him for it. And then the fire. Multiple ignition points throughout the building, set at specific locations chosen to maximize the destruction of forensic evidence. Not one fire, several. The specific knowledge of someone who understood what burns and what doesn't, who had thought about which surfaces hold evidence longest, who had been in this position before and had learned from it. The fire was not the end of what happened in that building. It was the punctuation, the specific professional signature of a person who had done something like this before, who had made mistakes before, and who was not going to make them again. The smell of that scene embedded itself in the memory of every person who entered that building in those first hours. Not the photographs, not the reports, the smell. The specific combination of accelerant and smoke and the sweet, rotten thing underneath that the fire had not had enough time to fully erase. The thing that arrives without warning in ordinary places years later, in parking lots and kitchens and restaurants that smell faintly of something burned, and brings that building back around you in an instant. Nothing I have seen before. That is what one investigator said, from a man who had seen things. Nothing I have seen before. Austin, in December 1991, was not a city that had a framework for this. It was still the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where a Tuesday night at a yogurt shop was just a Tuesday night at a yogurt shop. The murders fractured something in the city that December. Not loudly, quietly, in the specific way of a place that realizes it was never actually protected, that the warmth it thought insulated it from certain things was just warmth. The pressure on the Austin Police Department was not just immediate. It was the kind of pressure that gets inside an investigation and changes its shape from the inside out. Not dramatically, not all at once. The way water changes stone, slowly, persistently, until the investigation that started out looking for the truth had quietly become something else entirely. Something looking for a story the city could live with, a story that would make the pressure stop. Because here's what 8 years of unsolved quadruple murder does to a police department in a city that is watching. It does not just frustrate, it accusses. Every day those 4 girls stayed unsolved was another day the city looked at the Austin Police Department and asked the question that police departments cannot stand to be asked. Why haven't you found him yet? And after enough days of that question, the answer to it starts to matter more than the truth of it. They chased thousands of leads, hundreds of interviews, 8 years of work that produced nothing that held, and the pressure kept building, compressing, looking for somewhere to go. And then, in 1999, it found somewhere to go. 4 boys. Robert Springsteen was 17 when the murders happened. He was 25 in 1999. Michael Scott was 15 when the murders happened. He was 23 in 1999. Forrest Wellborn was 14. Maurice Pierce was 15. They had grown up in Austin. They knew each other. They wore dark clothes. They hung around together. They were the specific kind of young men that a system under pressure looks at and sees not what is there, but what it needs to be there. There was no physical evidence connecting any of them to the crime scene. No DNA, no fingerprints, no fibers, no hair. Nothing forensic that placed any of them inside that building on the night of December 6th, 1991. Nothing. Not one physical thread connecting any of these four boys to what happened in that yogurt shop. What the Austin Police Department had was 8 years of pressure with nowhere to go, and four boys who looked like the story they needed to tell. The investigation did not find them because the evidence led there. The investigation found them because the investigation had decided where it needed to end up and worked backward from that conclusion with the specific determined blindness of a system that has confused producing an answer with finding the truth. And the difference between those two things is four innocent people's lives. The interrogation rooms were not fully recorded. Sit with that. Capital murder investigations, interrogations that would form the entire backbone of the prosecution's case against four young men. Not fully recorded. What exists are partial recordings, transcripts, the accounts of the interrogators, and the accounts of the young men who sat in those rooms and who have spent 34 years trying to describe what it felt like to be inside them. The room never got louder. It just got smaller, until the walls pressed in so close you could hear your own heartbeat trying to bargain with the silence. And at some point your mouth started saying yes, just so the questions would finally stop. That is what it felt like. The specific physical reality of an interrogation that will not end is something that people who have not experienced it cannot fully understand, and people who have experienced it cannot fully forget. The room does not change. The interrogators do not raise their voices. There is no single dramatic moment where something breaks. It is slower than that, more patient than that. The questions come and come and come from different angles, with different implications, circling back to the same place, again and again and again, until the mind, under that sustained pressure, begins to lose its grip on the specific certainty that allows a person to maintain a position. The certainty of, I know what I did and did not do. I know where I was and was not. The certainty that feels absolute at the beginning of the room and becomes something else after hours of that room pressing in. After hours of being told in ways both direct and indirect that the certainty you feel is wrong, that you are wrong, that the only thing standing between you and the end of this room is the specific answer they are waiting for you to give. Robert Springsteen was in that room for hours. His lawyer was not present for significant portions of those hours. He was 25 years old. He was not stupid. He was not weak. He was a human being in a room specifically designed to produce a human breaking point, and the room eventually found his. At some point, his mouth said yes, not because yes was true, because yes was the only word in the room that had the power to make the room end. He said this from the moment the confession was recorded. He has said it every time he has spoken about it for 34 years. The confession was a lie he told to make the room stop. He has never said anything different, not once, in 34 years. Michael Scott said yes too, under similar conditions, in a similar room, with similar pressure applied to a similar young man who needed the room to end. And here is the specific detail that should have stopped everything before it started. The two confessions did not match, not in minor ways, in ways that matter. Two people who were supposedly in the same building on the same night describing two different sequences of events, two different accounts of what was done to which girl in which order, two different versions of the physical layout of the crime scene, details that two people who were actually there together in that specific building on that specific night could not get wrong in the specific ways these two confessions got them wrong. Because people who were actually there don't forget which wall the bodies were against, don't forget which girl was closest to the door, don't describe the same room in two different shapes, two confessions describing two different crimes. The prosecution used them both anyway. Robert Springsteen went to trial in 2001. The jury heard the confession. They did not hear about the DNA evidence collected from the crime scene that did not match any of the 4 boys. They heard what the prosecution chose to present, and they convicted. Capital murder. Death. Robert Springsteen was moved to death row. A young man who said from the first moment that the confession was a lie, he told to make the room stop. Sitting on death row. Waiting. Michael Scott was convicted in a separate trial. Life in prison. Forrest Wellborn was charged. 2 grand juries refused to indict him. 2 separate groups of citizens looked at the evidence against Forrest Wellborn and said no. The same evidence that convicted Springsteen and Scott. 2 grand juries said no. A trial jury said yes. Maurice Pierce spent 3 years in jail before the charges were dismissed. Not innocent, dismissed. He walked out carrying a dismissed charge in a city that knew his name, that knew what he had been accused of. He carried it for the rest of his life. Maurice Pierce died in 2010 in a confrontation with police after a traffic stop. He was 34 years old. He died with 4 murders attached to his name that he did not commit. He died being called something he was not. And the state of Texas had not yet said the words that would have changed that. He died waiting for words that did not come in time. Robert Eugene Brashers was not from Austin. He was passing through. And that is the specific thing that allowed him to do what he did and walk away from it. Not intelligence, not luck, movement. The specific structural advantage of a predator who understood that belonging nowhere is the closest thing to invisibility that a human being can achieve. He had killed before Austin, a woman in South Carolina in 1990. He would kill after Austin. At least 5 more that investigators have been able to connect to him, probably more that they have not. A trail of bodies across the country left by a man who was never in any single place long enough to be the person they were looking for. Think about what that means. Think about the specific lives attached to each of those killings, the specific families, the specific empty chairs at specific tables, all of them connected to the same man, all of them unconnected to each other, because the man who connected them never stayed long enough to be connected to anything. He walked into that yogurt shop on Guadalupe Street on December 6, 1991, and nobody in Austin knew his name. Nobody in Austin knew his face. Nobody in Austin had any reason to connect him to anything. He was a stranger in a city full of strangers, and he used that the way he always used it, completely, deliberately, without hesitation. He did what he did to those 4 girls. He set the fire, he walked out, he drove to El Paso. 2 days later, he was stopped at a border checkpoint. The man who bound and gagged and shot 4 teenage girls and set their building on fire, stopped at a checkpoint 60 miles from the Mexican border 2 days after the murders. That information existed in a database in 1991, findable, connected to nothing because nobody was looking for a drifter passing through, because the Austin Police Department had already decided who they were looking for. And it was not someone passing through. It was someone local, someone who fit the story they were already writing. Brashers drove away from that checkpoint. He kept moving. He kept killing. And in 1999, the same year the Austin Police Department arrested 4 boys for his crimes, Robert Eugene Brashers died in a standoff with police in Missouri. Self-inflicted gunshot. He never sat in a courtroom. He never heard the names Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers read to him by a judge. He never had to look at their families across a courtroom. He never had to hear what he took from them. He never had to answer for a single thing he did to those 4 girls on a Tuesday night in December. He just died. Free in Missouri in 1999. And on the other side of the country, Robert Springsteen was preparing to sit on death row for his crimes, and Michael Scott was preparing to serve a life sentence for his crimes, and Maurice Pierce was walking around Austin carrying the weight of his crimes attached to his name. And Robert Eugene Brashers was already in the ground, already beyond the reach of anything the system could have done to him, even if it had been trying to find him instead of 4 boys who fit a more convenient story. He died free. He died having never once answered for what he did. That is the specific, infuriating, nightmarish truth of this case that no $35 million settlement and no judge's declaration and no press conference can change. The real killer died free. The convictions against Springsteen and Scott were overturned in the mid-2000s. New DNA tests that revealed what 1991 technology could not. Evidence at the crime scene pointing away from all four boys, away from every single one of them. The prosecution wanted to retry Springsteen and Scott. A judge dismissed the charges in 2009. Not innocent, dismissed. They lived in the specific purgatory of the dismissed. Not convicted. Not exonerated. Somewhere in the gray space between. Carrying the weight of four murders they did not commit in a city that knew their names. In 2022, a cold case detective named Daniel Jackson was assigned to the yogurt shop case. He started over from the beginning. He pulled every file, every evidence bag, every piece of DNA collected from that building in December 1991. He sent it to a modern lab with modern technology. What came back changed everything. A DNA sample collected from under the fingernails of Amy Ayers came back as a match to Robert Eugene Brasher's, who had been dead for 23 years. Amy Ayers was 13 years old. She was bound. She was gagged. She was about to be shot in the head in a burning building in Austin, Texas, and she fought back, with the only things she had left, her hands, her fingernails. In the last moments of her life, she reached out and she scratched him. She took a piece of him with her. She held it under her fingernails, in an evidence bag, in a storage room, for 34 years, until a detective named Daniel Jackson sent it to a lab with technology that did not exist in 1991. And Amy Ayers finally told the world exactly who had been in that building with her. 13 years old, bound and gagged and about to die, and she still fought back. She is the reason this case was solved, not the investigation, not the system, not 34 years of institutional effort. Amy Ayers, her fingernails, the truth she refused to let go of, even when everything else was being taken from her. Detective Jackson kept going. He found the El Paso checkpoint arrest. He found Brasher's movements in December 1991. He built the case that should have been built 34 years earlier. In September 2025, the Austin Police Department announced the breakthrough. Chief Lisa Davis stood at a podium and said the words, "After 34 years, the Austin police have made a significant breakthrough. This is one of the most devastating and haunting cases in this city's history. 34 years, significant breakthrough," said out loud at a podium like it was something to be proud of. On February 20th, 2026, a packed Austin courtroom waited for a judge to speak. Robert Springsteen was there. Michael Scott was there. Forrest Wellborn was there. Travis County First Assistant District Attorney Trudy Strasburger stood up and said the words first. Over 25 years ago, the state prosecuted 4 innocent men for one of the worst crimes Austin has ever seen. 4 innocent men, said out loud, in a courtroom, by the same state that put one of them on death row. State District Judge Dana Blasey looked at the men in front of her, the men who had carried this for 34 years, the man who sat on death row, the man who served years in prison, the man who watched 2 grand juries say no and a trial jury say yes anyway. She said 2 words. "You are innocent." Robert Springsteen heard those words. Michael Scott heard those words. Forrest Wellborn heard those words. And then the judge turned to the 4th chair, the empty one, Maurice Pierce's chair. The chair of the man who spent 3 years in a cell for crimes he did not commit, who walked out carrying a label the state never removed, who died in 2010 being called something he was not, who never got to sit in that courtroom, who never got to hear those 2 words from a judge, who died waiting for a justice that did not come in time. She said them anyway. "You are innocent," to an empty chair. And the words just hung there, like they had finally arrived 34 years too late for the one man who needed to hear them most. In May 2026, the city of Austin agreed to pay $35 million to the surviving men and the family of Maurice Pierce. $35 million for death row, for life in prison, for 3 years in a cell for something you did not do, for dying with your name destroyed. You cannot buy back what was taken. You cannot settle what was done to Maurice Pierce. You can only put a number on it. Stand in a courtroom and say the words to an empty chair. Jennifer Harbison, Sarah Harbison, Eliza Thomas, Amy Ayers, 4 girls who went to work and went to wait for their friends on a Tuesday night in December. 4 girls who had plans for the rest of the week. Jennifer, who had no idea the silver bracelet she gave her little sister 2 weeks earlier would still be on Sarah's wrist when they found her. Sarah, whose bracelet with the tiny yogurt cup charm was still jingling when they carried her out of that building. Eliza, who came to drive her friends home. Amy, who came because 13 years old, and your best friend's closing shift is still better than being home alone. None of them going home. The real killer drove away into the dark. He spent 8 more years alive, 8 more years killing, and he died free in Missouri in 1999, while the system spent 34 years pointing at the wrong people, while one innocent man rotted on death row, while another died with his name destroyed, while a 13-year-old girl's fingernails held the truth in an evidence bag in a storage room, waiting for someone to look. Amy Ayers fought back. She was 13 years old, and she fought back. And 34 years later, the truth she left under her fingernails was the only thing in this entire case that could not be burned. The system buried everything else, the evidence, the truth, the names of 4 innocent men, the life of Maurice Pierce. But it could not bury Amy Ayers, not completely, not forever, because Amy Ayers fought back, and the truth she left behind was the only thing that could not be buried. This is what happens when the verdict comes before the truth. This is what happens when the system decides it would rather be right than correct. This is buried judgment, and we are just getting started. Subscribe. The files are open. The judge said you are innocent to an empty chair, and the words just hung there, like they had finally arrived 34 years too late for the one man who needed to hear them most.